Marla. Can you hear me okay? Hopefully the sound
Yep,
is
we can
good.
hear you.
Awesome. You never know with technology, so I just wanted to get a check. Welcome everyone. I want to say thank you to Iretta for having me to be their monthly webinar presentee today. As Marla said, we're going to talk a little bit about social isolation and what this looks like as far as our communities are concerned and how individuals have been impacted by isolation. So some of the research we're hearing kind of stems back from the pandemic moving forward. And then other things that we'll be talking about are just common terms and impacts and effects of isolation as it pertains to individuals and what research has shown over time. I'll also share a little bit about ways in which we all can play a part in reducing isolation. And then at the end of the webinar, as Marla said, if you have questions or just feedback or comments, things that may have struck you or been impactful for you as well, you may share those in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. So I'll make sure I leave enough time for us to address those at the end. Anytime I present on topics that have to do with humans, and there may be some conversation within today's presentation that may make you feel a certain way, or certain things may come up for you. It's always important to take care of yourself. So I like to throw that self-care component in. Whatever you need to do to ensure that you're good with what's being presented and or anything that may show up for you, make sure that you're doing just that. So I wanted to start out with a quote by Hjalmar Salderberg, and I feel like this quote really connects to what we're talking about when we think of isolation in its current form. This quote says, "I've borne my isolation with me through the crowd as the snail bears its house. For some people, isolation isn't a circumstance in which they find themselves, it's an innate characteristic." And so when I saw this quote, I thought it was very enlightening, but also very true to individuals that we may see every day, that we don't necessarily know what people are dealing with, how isolation impacts them, for how long people have dealt with isolation. And as this says, for some people, it might be an innate characteristic. So some people may have felt very isolated for all of their lives. Later in the presentation today, I'll talk a little bit about a specific individual that I've worked with in private practice, um, and some of the things that we discovered as it pertains to isolation. So you'll kind of be able to hear a real life example, and this has been many years ago, but you can hear a real life example of how this showed up for this particular individual. So mm, I think during the pandemic, and you'll hear me reference the pandemic quite a bit during this webinar, um, social isolation became more of a thing. More people became aware of what social isolation is, what it looks like. Experiencing social isolation for many, many individuals once the pandemic hit really just uncovered what many people may not have thought about on a regular and or experienced themselves. And so, for those of you that may be providers in some capacity, you have probably heard more of individuals that you're serving and or communities that you're working in, this concept of social isolation. And some of you may now be seeing the fallout from isolation and people being isolated from friends and family and coworkers over an extended period of time. The one thing about social isolation is it's not a new concept. Like it didn't just happen when the pandemic hit in 2020. So some of these articles that you see here on the screen, we see a healthcare company, Aetna, that talks about social isolation and loneliness, and it's the next public health issue. There's an article here that's from 2018. A lot of them show up from 2020 as the pandemic raged, and we started to see a lot more people struggling and suffering with isolation. So I highlight this. Even if you were to do your own Google search, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles and research that show up about social isolation. So again, today we're going and the impact of COVID-19. We'll also talk about empathy and the role in relation and impact individuals and communities. And lastly, we will identify benefits of support for individuals that are experiencing social isolation. So, to start out with a definition, when we're talking about social isolation, what exactly is it? Here defined is the lack of social contacts and having few people to interact with on a regular basis. So, social isolation is the number of contacts with people on a regular and or consistent basis. Um, to note here, one of the concepts that you have heard or probably have heard interchangeably with isolation is loneliness. And there is a difference between the two. You'll hear me reference some about loneliness because that is where a lot of the research comes from. But here also, you'll note that an individual can live alone and not feel lonely or isolated, right? So an individual can live by themselves. They don't feel lonely, they don't feel isolated, but in the reverse, a person can be amongst a group of people and still feel lonely, right? So, as we're journeying through today and we're talking about isolation, I want you to keep in mind the definition of this is the lack of social contacts that an individual has over a period of time. Okay. So, again, as I said before, loneliness and social isolation can co occur. And then we're looking at, again, like I said, the number of interactions that a person experiences is connected to social isolation. A lot of the research about social isolation you will find tailors to older adults because that's a growing population that we're seeing very rapidly. Older adults being impacted by social isolation, especially during the pandemic. What were we seeing? We were seeing a lot of older adults who lived alone, who may not have had family close to them, or they didn't have caregivers. And so what we started to see was an influx of older adults really battling social isolation because of the pandemic and not being able to connect with other people and or family or caregivers. Um, and then as we talk about social isolation and we're looking at additional impacts, we may see that individuals are living an unhealthy lifestyle, which contributes to that isolation. Their health implications and or early mortality rates. So mortality increases as social isolation and loneliness increases in individuals. Again, as we're talking about isolation and the impact, 1 in 3 older adults are impacted by isolation. And as you research or you're kind of looking through trying to find more of the statistics, as far as age is concerned with the older adults, we're looking at research that starts at about the age of 50. So individuals that are impacted generally are 50 and above. But what we also know that with the pandemic, obviously we saw social isolation impacting everyone from youth to teens to adults and older adults. Um, an impact on individuals' physical health, mental health, quality of life, and again, we're looking at longevity of life. With social isolation, some of the research is starting to say approximately 15 years of an individual's life can be shortened by the impact of social isolation and loneliness. So what we're noticing is that as more individuals are being impacted by social isolation and loneliness, their quality of life and the longevity of life are declining. And again, we're starting to recognize this within our communities as a public health issue and one that definitely needs to be seen as priority. So I wanted to throw in some statistical information just to kind of paint a picture so that you're able to see in different terms what this looks like. And so a quarter of all US households are one person households. So that's 25% of households within the US are um, single-headed households. And as we look at chronic loneliness and the impact, and this is at age 45 and over, 42.6 million Americans are impacted by chronic loneliness. All right, so think about that 42.6 million Americans. It's a lot of people. As we're talking about how do we solve this, how do we navigate this, we talk about social connection, which I'll get to later in the webinar, but a greater social connection is associated with about 50% of lower of early death. Is that yes, when social isolation and loneliness are a factor in an individual's life, their longevity for life actually declines. That, mortality rate, it increases. And so with social connection, what we're able to do is reduce potentially that 15-year mark, right? So the goal of eliminating social isolation is to socially connect more individuals. Again, another statistic, and this comes from the National Institute on Aging, and it equates the health risk of prolonged isolation to the equivalent of someone smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So if you think about that, 15 cigarettes a day is quite a few cigarettes a week if you're looking at daily, and there's 7 days in a week. It's a lot of cigarettes. So it's over 100 cigarettes per week, which is the equivalent of the impact of prolonged isolation on an individual. The AARP, along with the National Institute on Health and mental health, have a lot of additional information that we're starting to see on social isolation and loneliness and the effects of that. So I'm going to have Marla to throw up our first poll question. And this question reads, have you personally experienced social isolation within the last 2 years? And you may want to look at 2021 and 2022, or you may want to go back to 2020 and 2021. You can kind of gauge which you would rather answer. But again, have you personally experienced social isolation within the last 2 years? And we'll kind of hang out here for a second to allow people to answer.
Yeah, I'll leave that poll up for about 30 more seconds. So if you haven't answered yet, please get that in now.
I feel like I should have like Jeopardy music right now for people. All right. So, from those of you that answered, what we see is that about 48% of you said that you have experienced social isolation in your own defined way. 27% of you have said no. And then we didn't have about 26% that didn't answer, which is fine. But when you look at this, we can even see here that for our own personal selves, many of us have, identified that in some facet, which is kind of our own way of identifying what social isolation looks like for us, we've experienced. Thank you for that. Thank you for answering that. So, a little bit about COVID-19 and the pandemic and the impact. Some of the things that we've seen as far as the pandemic and how it's impacted individuals is an increase in mental health issues, whether an issue that was already pre-existing prior to the pandemic and or a mental health issue or concern that actually arose from the stressors that many experienced during the pandemic. We also saw an increase in substance use and abuse. Obviously, the death of many individuals, unfortunately, due to the pandemic. Grief and loss issues escalated as well. We saw a significant decline in motivation for a lot of people, which there's still a fallout from that people are having a harder time being motivated for a number of reasons. And also issues with supply and demand. And supply and demand kind of range when we're looking at healthcare, education, um, just different job arenas. We've seen a huge need for more everyone, right? In healthcare. So, those of you that currently work in healthcare, whether you're a counselor or a nurse or a physician of some sort, we're hearing now we need more people. We need more people in the field to be working to serve those that are coming through the doors who need assistance. If you've just noticed around your communities, wherever you are, I'm sure many of you have witnessed the um, now hiring signs that are up, maybe coming across your email, or the $5,000 bonus, sign-ons for people that are willing to accept new positions and things of that nature. And so the pandemic really opened up a lot of need for many individuals. As we look at the increase in substance use and abuse, um, there's a study that was done in 2020, in December of 2020, just looking at why there was such a significant increase in substance use and abuse. And for many of you, you have probably, seen or heard of some of the statistics with that. And this one particular study, was done about alcohol consumption during the pandemic. And the reason was about 46% of the people that were surveyed for this particular study said that they had experienced increased stress. And another 34% said that the alcohol was available, and so they consumed it. And then 30% strictly said that they drank out of boredom. And so at the height of the pandemic, when many people were on lockdown, when you could only be out for a certain amount of time, things like home delivery or curbside pickup, those things increased, and businesses were trying to stay afloat. People had greater access to alcohol and things of that nature. And so, what we started seeing was an increase in binge drinking and extreme binge drinking, which the same study shows about 41% of people actually said they began binge drinking during the pandemic. So, again, what we're noticing is an increase in a lot of different arenas that can impact individuals and their inability to not isolate themselves. Um, as we're talking about mental health and isolation, conditions and symptoms that we noticed and continue to notice during the pandemic and even to this date, depression and anxiety were two of the most reported mental health conditions. Sadness that a lot of people experienced, grief. Again, you're looking at grief and loss due to a lot of deaths within communities. Um, Even individuals themselves that battled COVID and or conditions post COVID, having COVID, we're seeing a lot of mental health concerns. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which I don't believe we've even, chipped the iceberg on that. We're just seeing the tip of what the fallout from the pandemic with PTSD will probably look like. And then also, we've seen an increase in suicide as well. So, as we're, talking about what we're seeing in our communities, I want you to take just a minute to think about in your work or even in your own personal circles, what are things that you have noticed as increased within those that you're serving, those within your community? Does any of this resonate with you? So we'll shift and talk about causes of isolation, of social isolation, and understand that there are many causes of social isolation. And so there are many things that may not even be presented here that you may think, oh, yeah, like this should be on that list. And that is perfectly fine. You can kind of add it to your own notes. But some of the things that you'll see here, obviously, we just talked about mental health issues. Other causes of social isolation are poverty, lack of social activities and purpose. So, again, as we're talking about the pandemic and we're talking about people who really are struggling to maybe get back on the bandwagon of being socially active in their communities, people who are, redefining their purpose can be reasons as to why they isolate. They don't have what we talked about earlier. They don't have the motivation that they had prior to the pandemic. Individuals that live in remote environments. And that's something that I think many communities have struggled to try and figure out how we get individuals that live in remote environments, how do we get them more connected? We're talking about violence within communities. We're also talking about potentially domestic issues, so violence within the home, caregiving issues. We did see a huge increase with caregiving over the last 2 to 3 years. And with caregiving, it can be very isolating for a lot of individuals. Discrimination. So we're looking at discrimination. It could be discrimination within the workplace, it could be discrimination within your community. That is another cause for isolation. And then grief and loss. Again, as we're talking about um, pre pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, or during the pandemic, there was a significant amount of grief and loss. And so people are coming to terms with a new way of living, living without loved ones or those within their community, as our communities have shifted. Maybe for many individuals, the way in which they have lived in the past is now different. And so, what we're seeing is people really working to try to figure out how to adjust to new ways of living, to new environments. If you think about individuals that have been displaced from their homes for a number of reasons, during the pandemic, there were a lot of financial issues. And so, people not being able to maintain housing. Um, if you're looking at floods or hurricanes and people that have lost their homes, people are being uprooted from what is a norm for them. And so that isolation is just a component of what happens when people are uprooted from environments that they're used to, environments where they were once able to thrive, and that's no longer the case. So again, this list, there are many other causes for isolation. So don't think that this is like kind of that stuck list, but there are many other additives that, we can incorporate into this list of causes for social isolation. So now we're going to shift and we're going to talk about empathy. And this is a really important component as we're talking about isolation and how do we connect more with people? How do we ensure that the work that we're doing with people within community, how do we engage more? And empathy and social isolation go hand in hand. So, what we're seeing is that when empathy is incorporated into individuals that are isolated and are lonely, there's a shift for those people. So I want to start out with this is really is a very quick video of individuals, and you'll kind of see empathy, as I say, in human form. There isn't any sound to it. So what I would like for you to do is just pay attention to what you view here. So I'll go back to that again. And I'll play it one more time just in case you missed it. Um, I guess I should have put a little disclaimer out to get your feels in order because it really is a very empathetic video. All right. So again, as we go to talk about empathy and how it shows up as we're thinking about isolation, it doesn't clearly, like the video, it doesn't take much for us to utilize what we have. And sometimes it's just the ability to show up for someone. It's the ability for us to just be able to sit in a space with someone. We may not have to give of anything other than our ear or our heart, as you see in the video, giving of a shoulder, right, to another person that may be in need. And so, as we talk about empathy, it's the ability to share the emotional state of another person. Positive empathy, as we're talking about that, is an emotion regulator. So, with positive empathy, what we know about it is we'll get a little bit sciencey here for just a second. A lot happens in that frontal lobe of a person's brain, and so what happens is that an individual may experience um, a shift in their mood. An individual may start making different decisions. Their cognitive is different when empathy becomes a part of the equation. And so, as we're talking about positive empathy as an emotion regulator, that frontal cortex says, hey, there's something going on here. And so, when we acknowledge empathy and we're building that into the existence of a person that may be experiencing loneliness, isolation, that isolation and loneliness will decrease. Why is that? Because empathy is there. So if you think about a person who's isolated and you connect with that person, now what you're able to see is there's some type of a shift that happens with that individual. If you think about me, if you've ever really in a and that person comes in to meet with you, or even just in a phone call or a video chat, um, you notice once you've connected with them, how that person may sigh, like, oh, I just needed someone to hear me. Or, wow, thank you for just listening to me, right? And so that empathy is embedded into that person now because what that person needed was another person to come alongside them. Next, I'll talk about three different types of empathy and how that shows up and why it's important when we're talking about isolation. Emotional, cognitive, and applied empathy are three types of empathy that we can all exhibit in some type of way. When we're talking about emotional empathy, that's saying that I share feelings, right? So it's the emotional side that we're sharing with that other person. When we're talking about another person, and then applied empathy says, this is like I understand what you have shared with me, or I understand your experience, and now I want to do something about it. I want to apply what I have learned or understand about your particular situation, and I want to act. I want to do something. And so, we're talking about how can we help people, how can we help them more connected. And if you look, again, I say look up articles and or some of the research that talks about empathy in the workplace. Okay. And you think about your workplace and where you work. If it lacked empathy, if there were not one empathetic person in your workplace, would that be somewhere that you would want to work? Right. And so I ask, what would that workplace look like if it lacked empathetic individuals? If we're service provider organization, our organization doesn't have a foundation of empathy for our clients or those consumers that we serve, you're going to have a lot of issues. You're going to have a lot of complaints. You're going to have a lot of people that may not receive that help that they need because of their inability to socially connect with you as a provider or with the organization that's providing that service. So, these three components of empathy are really important as we look to decrease isolation and loneliness in individuals. And I'll go back for a second to this slide where, again, what we're looking at is the ability to share this emotional state with another individual, right? And so, again, in this frontal cortex or this frontal lobe, there's something going on there when empathy is enacted, when a person feels connected with another person because that person exudes empathy. There's a shift that happens. And so, this component of positive empathy is really critical when we're talking about social isolation and how we can decrease what other individuals are experiencing. So, as we're talking about empathy and positive empathy, should this be considered in reducing social isolation? Would you agree or disagree? Again, positive empathy should be considered in reducing social isolation. We'll give it a few more seconds here.
Yeah. Right. Closing down here in a second.
Right. All right. So thank you for that, Marla. As you can see, um, positive empathy should be considered in reducing social. So 50 agreed, 3% disagreed, and then we had about 40% that did not answer, which is okay again. So again, 57% of you believe that positive empathy should be considered in reducing social isolation. So thank you for that. Okay. So as I said, kind of at the top of the hour when I started, um, I wanted to share a little bit about CJ, and this individual's name has been changed just for confidentiality purposes. Um, but CJ was a 30-year-old woman in her 30s with two small children, and CJ was very isolated, and those are her words. CJ's days were filled with work and raising her children. Her children were to she, she would get snacks, which she would out for them, um, getting themselves dressed. They did need support with things like homework. She made dinner for her family. And then things obviously with school or school related, she would show up when she needed to do that as well. But where CJ really struggled was with isolating herself at home. And CJ would often say, I can tell how I'm doing by whether or not I isolate myself. And isolation for her was her bedroom. And so each time we met, I would say, how many days have you spent more time in your bedroom when you're home versus outside in a different room? So whether it was like her family room setting or the kitchen or out on her patio. And that is how we would gauge what was going on with CJ or her need to be more connected to people. And CJ had a history of family discord. So there was a lot of discord within her family, as she named it. And as we met more and talked more, CJ would say, I kind of think that I've always isolated myself. She said, as far back as I could remember. When my parents would argue, I would go to my room. I would turn my music up as loud as I could to just drown out their fighting, their arguing, and things of that nature. And so I guess it's just something that I've probably always done when things feel really intense. And so, as CJ and I continued to meet, there were certain things that were going on with CJ that I began to question. And some of those things were health related. And one of the questions that I asked CJ was, when was the last time you actually saw your physician just for a checkup to just kind of check things out? And she's like, "Oh, I don't do doctors and stuff like that. Every time I go, I feel like they look down on me. They talk to me like I don't understand English, and so that's not something that I'm necessarily wanting to do." So CJ and I actually spent a couple of hours together looking for physicians that she felt comfortable with, and making phone calls to try and get CJ set up with an appointment. So to kind of fast forward through a lot of this, CJ ended up keeping the appointment and actually going to see the physician and having some tests done and different things of that nature, starting a medication for a temporary need. But I remember talking to CJ a week post her physician's appointment, and then about a couple of months post that appointment. And CJ's words were, nobody ever really cared enough throughout my life to tell me how important going to the doctor was. Um, and long story short, the things that the physician had worked through with her, CJ said, I actually don't think that I was as depressed as I thought. I just needed to get some things under control, which has really helped me to be better. And I'm so glad that I can be a better mother to my children and not isolate myself in my room and them in theirs, but we can actually do things together. We're actually, playing board games and we're taking, the puppy for a walk and things of that nature. And so I share this story about CJ because how many of us have CJs that we're currently working with or have worked with, where there are multiple things going on, and the isolation may be a result of things that can actually be repaired or worked on to bring people out of isolation. And so CJ's story is just one of many, in which, we see and we hear things about people in isolation, and we may not always know where to start. But getting that background history and really taking the time in an empathetic way to understand the background, the history, right? CJ saying, I don't want to see a doctor because I feel like they look down on me, they talk down to me. Just taking the time to be able to say, let's work through and find someone that you feel most comfortable with. Again, embedding that empathy into practice is very key in helping individuals to navigate that journey of coming out of isolation. So it's a wonderful, kind of a moment to be able to celebrate with consumers when they find their way out of isolation into a better space. That doesn't mean that they're not going to go back, or that doesn't mean that they're fully out of it. But when they can see a different perspective, as we've talked about, it does make for that optimism of clients can get. So to wrap up, we're going to go into our last poll question about isolation. People that are more socially isolated, or people are more socially isolated now than ever before. Do you believe that to be true or false? People are more socially isolated now than ever before. True or false?
All right, gonna keep it open for about 30 more seconds here. So if you don't have an answer in, please do that now. And I've shared those results. Can you see them?
Yes, I
Okay,
see them.
great.
Perfect. Thank you, Marla. So, 64% of you believe that people are more socially isolated than ever before. 9% of you believe that not to be true, and that's okay. And then we had about 27% that opted out of answering, and that's okay as well. But again, 64% of you believe that people are more isolated now than ever before. So, as we go into talking about the benefits and supports for people that are socially isolated, I want you to continue to think about how you show up in this. What is your role in working with individuals who may be isolated? in your own kind of space or your own community, what does isolation look like? Are you noticing an increase in the areas and the spaces that you reside and work in? So there's a quote by Holt Lundstedt, and she talks about social isolation and what it looks like to have support for those that are isolated. And she says the medical community can play a key role in identifying, preventing, and mitigating the risk associated with social isolation and loneliness. And so, yes, the medical community is one part of those key players who can definitely work to identify those that are dealing with social isolation, how we prevent it, and mitigating the risks that are associated with it. Again, if you think back to the story that I shared about CJ, part of what we were navigating was how do we get you into the medical care that you need in order to kind of see what's going on, right? And as some of her medical concerns were addressed and were better, what we started to see was a decrease in that isolation because she was feeling better. She was able to sleep better. And so, again, some of the things that um, were causing her to isolate from friends, from family, started to decrease because other issues were addressed. And so, again, I just throw out to you what might be your part that you play in individuals that are socially isolated. The next couple of slides I'm going to show are a couple of tools that you may be interested yourself in looking at, but also if it's something that you can utilize or uh, understand are lonely or socially isolated, and the Toronto Empathy Scale. So this is the UCLA Loneliness Scale. It's a 20 question scale that looks at different components having to do with loneliness. And so what this can be is just really a guide or an outline or a sketch for you to utilize with consumers so that they can also see themselves where they're rating on this loneliness scale. If you'll see there in number 16, it says, I feel isolated from others, right? So that isolation piece is lumped into this loneliness scale. And then, as I talked about, the Toronto Empathy Questionnaire is again, it's a 16 question questionnaire. And again, it's something that can be used as a tool to just give you some additional insight into empathy and what that looks like for different individuals, or you yourself, maybe on a team, working within an organization as well. So again, it just gives insight into where you fall as it pertains to empathy. So the World Health Organization has, again, a ton of information about social isolation and how it shows up as one of the social determinants of health. And one of the things that they had was this infographic that I thought was really cool. And what it talks about is just ways to reduce social isolation and loneliness. And as you can see, face to face or digital contact. Again, through the pandemic, many of us went into this kind of virtual world, digital contact with different individuals. And so we're learning different ways of being able to socially connect within our communities, promoting age-friendly environments, and that can be for youth, teens, older adults, and adults. So, are we creating or can we create environments that are appropriate for different age groups so that individuals can come together to socially connect? And then lastly, they talk about laws and policies that foster social connections. So within each of our communities, there may be laws or policies that are in place or maybe should be in place that can help us to be able to assist others in becoming more socially connected within our communities. So again, as we're talking about social isolation and loneliness, what we're looking to do is to reduce that so that people can and do feel more socially connected and or have the tools to know how to socially connect with others within their community. So seven keys to social support and those with isolation. Again, as I'm talking, what we're looking to do is social connection is the goal. We want to be able to socially connect with other individuals. As we're talking to individuals and supporting other individuals, it's important to understand the mental health needs that may be there. So, does someone need to meet with a licensed physician or a counselor for certain mental health needs or concerns? Prioritizing support, which is important for those that are isolated. Who do I need to put in my circle to feel more connected, and who do I need to utilize to feel more supported where I am? So we want to prioritize support. Play, which is something that a lot of people forget about. You know, as we're stressed and we have a lot of things going on, we forget to play, which is to alleviate that stress, even if it's just momentary, to uh, do something fun. You know, if you have kids at home or you borrow someone else's kids, I'm always telling people I will loan my kids to you so that you can socially connect with my children and play. And so playing is one of those things that does benefit all of us because it allows us to just release some stress. And so finding your own way to play is another way to be able to connect with other people and or just in doing something that you enjoy. How do we offer support to others? That's a really critical key way to support other people is offering some type of support. As we saw in that video with the two little boys, what did he offer? He offered his shoulder for his friend to just lay there and rest for a moment. Um, the R is to remember to insert empathy. So empathy is key. Empathy is key in supporting those that are socially isolated. And then finally, just thinking about how you can embrace nature. Does it mean that you need to go into the deep, dark forest? No, it doesn't. It absolutely does not. But it may be just a walk around your community. It could be gardening. It could be growing some type of herbs or different things within your home, planting flowers, right? So, thinking about nature and what it can offer those that are socially isolated. There's a lot more research that's coming up about embracing nature and the mental health benefits to that. And so, again, adding that now as one of the keys to supporting individuals that are isolated. So, what we really want to do is ultimately we want to get people out of isolation and into a different environment. So, what might that environment be? There's a lot of different answers to that, but once people are able to make that shift and that transition, you may see that individuals are able to engage differently and interact differently within their own communities. So, as I'm wrapping up, back when the pandemic actually was kind of at the height in 2020, I connected with two different groups. Our local news, I'm here in Indiana, covered a couple of stories. One was with an amazing group of women who are either battling cancer or they are thrivers and survivors. And we did a cookies and laughter connection, and it was all virtual. And as you can see, there are a lot of women there smiling and laughing, and we're throwing our hands up in the air, and we were just sharing and taking the time to connect. And again, being creative in a time where we had limited resources as a community. Another was just sharing about laughter and how it can help people cope with stress and a lot that was going on during the pandemic. And so, everything that I've talked about today will be in the references, so you can go to the reference list. There will be a handout that will have a lot of the resources in there that you can look those up online for your own reference. As you know, we're looking post this webinar today. So very fun times there. And finally, I want to end with a quote by James Baldwin. Um, he says, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was the books that taught me the things that tormented me the most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive." And that really resonated with me that when we think that we're alone, and this may be for you, and this may be for the people that you serve within your community, just when we think we're isolated and alone and by ourselves, we do have people that may be able to empathetically connect with us in a way that they understand and or they may have experienced something similar. And so, as this quote by James Baldwin says, it's just when I thought that I was alone that I really wasn't. That I realized in connecting with books and stories that there are other people that have been through exactly what I've been through, right? And so, as we end this webinar and in this presentation, I just want you to think about the number of people that you serve and how you can show up better for them. We are all better together, connected. And yes, people will continue to be socially isolated, but we all have something that's within us that we can give to other people. And so do your part, share information that you may have learned today with other people. And I'm sending good vibes to everyone that you continue to do the good work that you're doing out in your communities with the people. All right, that's it.
Thanks so much, Nikisha. Are you willing to take a few questions? We definitely had one come in, and then if anyone else has any more, they could submit.
Sure.
But right now we're getting just a lot of positive comments saying that this is great information. Thanks for such a great webinar. The one question that did come in said, do you think the information and findings regarding loneliness and short lifespan relates to elderly couples when one passes away, the other one often passes away not long afterwards? So
Yes, I
interesting
do
thoughts.
think that that is very connected. We're actually starting to hear more of that. Recently I heard a story of that, a couple that I think had been married 40 or 50 years, and the wife passed away, and then shortly after the husband passed away. And so I think that there's again some connection, right, with that, as we're talking about and thinking about empathy and how that shows up, and we're just talking about connections in general with other human beings. And we're talking about, what happens to our bodies physiologically. I think that that all plays a part into what happens with people, unfortunately, in that way. It's a great question or statement, question statement.
And then one more just came in. Are there major differences in the ways older women deal with loneliness versus how older men do?
Um, I can't answer that specifically. I can answer it with saying that I do believe that people do deal with loneliness different.
Mhm.
I think part of that is what or who people have access to, right? One of the things that we do know, yes, and it is in the research, is when we look at mental health and the number of men versus women that access mental health services and continue with mental health services, there is a grave difference there. And so we do know that men have a harder time connecting in mental health services or with mental health services initially. Excuse me. And I think that just has to do with a lot of the stigma that's attached in our communities about mental health services in general. So that plays into communities of color and access to mental health. But then I think that also plays into our gender when we're talking about male and female and how they access mental health services.
Mhm. All right. Well, that is it in the way of questions. Thank you so much, Nikisha, for this wonderful webinar. I just have a few housekeeping items if people want to stay on to hear about getting their CEUs. Again, thanks to Nikisha for a great webinar. Thank you everyone for your participation and your great questions. We would like to remind all participants that a PDF um, of today's information will be sent along with a recording of today's webinar. That will be uploaded to the webinar library located on iRetta's website sometime next week, and we'll also send an email out to participants. I now want to remind you of our evaluation and CEU process. You will receive several follow-up emails from us. The first email will include a link to the evaluation, and the second email will include step-by-step instructions on how to obtain CEUs. Please note that it will take 48 hours for your CEUs to become available because our MyIRetta profile or our MyIRetta account has to cross-check your attendance records with WebEx. We would like to especially request that you fill out our evaluation. It should take no more than 2 minutes of your time. Again, we want to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to participate. If you have any questions, please email us. The email address is info@iretta.org. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Thanks again, Nikisha, and thank you to all the participants. I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, Nikisha.
Bye bye.